1966, Quảng Trị Province, South Vietnam. A patrol of 12 United States Marines moves through a corridor of jungle so dense that sunlight never reaches the ground. The air is wet. The heat is suffocating. Insects fill every silence. Beneath their boots, the earth is soft, dark, and ancient, and it is watching them. They are among the most well-equipped soldiers in human history. They carry M16 rifles, flak jackets, radio equipment, grenades, and the full industrial weight of the most powerful military nation the world has ever seen. Air support is minutes away. Artillery can be called within seconds. Their government has spent billions of dollars preparing them for exactly this kind of war. And yet, every single one of them is terrified. Not of enemy soldiers, not of artillery, not of ambush in the conventional sense. They are terrified of the ground itself, of the leaves, of the shadows, of the silence that comes just before the snap of a triggered mechanism hidden beneath a single harmless-looking patch of disturbed soil. They are terrified of bamboo. Chapter 2. The Impossible Outcome. What happened in the jungles of Vietnam was not simply a guerrilla war. It was something older, stranger, and far more psychologically devastating than any modern military doctrine had ever prepared for. A peasant army, outnumbered, outgunned, and outspent by a factor of 1,000 to 1, chose a weapon that required no ammunition, no training beyond basic carpentry, no supply chain, and no maintenance. A weapon made entirely from the forest itself. And it worked. Chapter 3. The Central Question. How did a jungle plant bring the United States Army to its psychological knees? How did thousands of handcrafted traps, built by farmers, women, and teenagers with no formal military training, inflict casualties, shatter morale, and fundamentally alter the strategy of the greatest military force in the modern world? This is that story. Chapter 4. Historical Context. To understand what happened in the jungles of Vietnam, you must first understand what America thought it was walking into. By 1965, the United States had committed ground troops to the war in numbers that grew monthly. The logic of Washington was simple and confident. Technological superiority would decide the conflict. B-52 bombers could flatten entire grid squares of jungle from altitudes too high to see. Napalm could strip vegetation from hillsides in seconds. Helicopters gave commanders unprecedented mobility. Chemical defoliants like Agent Orange could rob the enemy of the very jungle that hid them. Against this arsenal, what could a peasant army possibly do? The National Liberation Front, called the Viet Cong by American forces, had no tanks, no air force, no navy, and no industrial base. Their supply line, the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail, was bombed constantly. Their soldiers sometimes fought entire engagements armed with captured American weapons because their own supplies were so unreliable. On paper, they had already lost. On paper, it was not a contest. But the Viet Cong were fighting on ground they had known their entire lives. And they had been planning for this war. Not for years, but for generations. Chapter 5. Discovery of the weapon. The strategy was called Dao Tran, the struggle, and it was not designed to defeat the Americans in open battle. It was designed to make every single step on Vietnamese soil cost something, to fill the land itself with consequence, to transform the jungle into a weapon so pervasive, so invisible, and so psychologically relentless that the most powerful army in history would eventually refuse to walk through it. The instrument of that transformation was the booby trap. The Viet Cong did not invent the concept of field traps. Vietnamese fighters had used them against the Chinese, against the Mongols, against the French. But what emerged during the American War was something far more sophisticated, a systematic, industrialized, and brilliantly engineered trap building program that eventually produced hundreds of distinct designs, each adapted to specific terrain, specific American patrol behaviors, and specific psychological effects. And almost all of them were built from bamboo. Bamboo was everywhere. It grew faster than any tree in the jungle, up to 1 meter per day in certain conditions, and it could be harvested, shaped, sharpened, and weaponized by a 10-year-old child. It required no metal, no factory, no special tools. A farmer with a machete could build a functioning killing device in under an hour using materials that had grown 20 meters from his front door. Chapter 6. The Impossible Plan. The most famous device was the punji stake trap. A pit, perhaps 1 meter deep and just wide enough to swallow a man's leg, would be dug in the jungle floor, then filled with sharpened bamboo stakes angled upward. The entrance was covered with a layer of leaves and thin branches, held in place by a fragile lattice that would collapse under the weight of a boot but hold against the lighter pressure of rain and wind. Some stakes were simple. Others were coated with animal feces to cause infection. Others were reversed, angled inward at the top, so that a man who stepped in and tried to pull his leg free would drive the stakes deeper rather than extract himself. The trap was not usually meant to kill. It was meant to wound. A dead soldier was removed from the battlefield. A wounded soldier required 2 or 3 other soldiers to carry him, a helicopter to evacuate him, a surgeon to treat him, and weeks of medical recovery. One punji trap could remove 4 men from the field and occupy military resources for a month. But the punji pit was only the beginning. Chapter 7. Execution with High Tension. The Bouncing Betty, a device adapted by the Viet Cong from captured American mines, would launch upward before detonating, directing its lethal force at the groin and torso rather than the feet. The mace trap consisted of a heavy bamboo ball studded with sharpened spikes, suspended in the jungle canopy and triggered by a tripwire, swinging down to strike a man with the force of a battering ram. The cartridge trap used a bullet casing embedded in a sharpened wooden spike, pointed upward through a small hole in a board buried in a path. When stepped on, the primer detonated and the round fired upward through the sole of a boot. There were traps inside buildings, traps in latrines, traps designed to trigger only after the first man passed over them, targeting the second or third in a patrol column. There were traps designed to be found, crude, obvious devices left in visible places to redirect patrols into areas where far more sophisticated mechanisms waited. There were traps built inside traps, so that the medic who rushed to aid a triggered casualty would detonate a secondary device. Each design was documented by Viet Cong military engineers, refined based on results, and distributed through the tunnel network as instructional drawings, a catalog of invention that grew month by month, adaptation by adaptation. The jungle had become a machine, and the Americans had stepped inside it. Chapter 8. The Climax Moment. By 1967, booby traps accounted for between 11 and 17% of all American casualties in Vietnam, depending on the region and the period measured. In some provinces, the figure climbed far higher. The 1st Marine Division reported that in certain operational zones, traps were causing more casualties than direct enemy contact. But the physical toll was only part of the story. The psychological effect was something no military historian had ever quite seen before. American soldiers began to move differently, not slower. Terrified men do not simply slow down. They moved with a specific, tightly wound anxiety, a constant awareness of the ground beneath every footstep, a compulsion to scan each meter of Earth before committing weight to it. Veterans described it as a particular kind of madness, the inability to walk through any space ever again without looking for the wire, the disturbed soil, the bent grass that meant something had been placed there before their arrival. Entire units began to refuse patrol routes, not out of cowardice. These were trained soldiers who had demonstrated courage under direct fire. But because walking into jungle threaded with invisible mechanisms felt fundamentally different from walking toward a visible enemy, against a human adversary, there was agency, there was reaction, there was the possibility of survival through skill and force. Against a buried bamboo spike, there was nothing, only luck, only the random geometry of which square foot of earth you placed your weight on. The military called it a morale problem. The soldiers called it something else. They called it the feeling of being hunted by the ground itself. Chapter 9. Escape. American response. The United States Army responded with resources, as it always did. New boots were developed with steel insoles. Mine detection equipment was issued. Engineers were deployed to clear patrol routes. Tunnel rats, small soldiers selected specifically for their size, were trained to enter Viet Cong underground networks and dismantle trap manufacturing operations from the inside. It was not enough. The traps were too numerous, too varied, too embedded in the landscape to be systematically removed. For every cleared route, another existed. For every detected device, 10 remained hidden. The Viet Cong rebuilt faster than American engineers could destroy. An entire village could replenish a stripped trap network in a single night, working by moonlight with tools they had used since childhood. In 1968, the U.S. Army commissioned a formal study of the booby trap problem. Its conclusions were stark. The report noted that the psychological impact of booby traps was disproportionate to their lethality, that the constant low-level threat they represented degraded unit cohesion and combat effectiveness in ways that conventional casualty figures could not capture. It did not recommend a solution, because there was none. The trap was not a technology, it was a philosophy. It was the deliberate decision by a people defending their homeland to turn their own environment, every tree, every riverbank, every footpath worn smooth by generations of farming feet, into an instrument of resistance. It could not be out-manufactured because it required almost no manufacturing. It could not be outsupplied because its raw material grew wild on every hillside. It could not be countered by firepower because it had no position to fire upon. It could only be endured. Chapter 10. Historical Impact. The war ended in 1975. The last American combat forces had withdrawn 2 years earlier, under an agreement that acknowledged what the battlefield had already made plain. The most expensive, most technically sophisticated military operation in American history had failed to pacify a country of rice farmers and jungle paths. The booby trap did not win the Vietnam War alone. The causes of American failure were complex: political, strategic, cultural, diplomatic. But historians who have studied the ground-level experience of the conflict consistently identify the trap campaign as one of the most psychologically significant elements of the entire war. It changed how American soldiers perceived the war, how they reported it, how they remembered it, and ultimately, how their country came to understand what had gone wrong. The trap campaign also changed military doctrine in ways that persist to the present day. The U.S. military's approach to improvised explosive devices, the roadside bombs that would later define the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, draws directly from lessons learned in Vietnamese jungles. The psychological dimension of asymmetric warfare, the vulnerability of conventional forces to low-tech persistent threats, the strategic value of denying an enemy the feeling of safety in any terrain, all of these concepts were written in blood on jungle paths between 1965 and 1973. The Vietnamese understood something ancient that American military planners had forgotten. A weapon does not need to be sophisticated to be decisive. It does not need to be expensive to be effective. It needs only to make the enemy afraid of the next step, afraid of the earth beneath him, afraid of the silence. Chapter 11. Today, in the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City, there is a room dedicated to the booby trap campaign. Photographs, diagrams, reconstructed devices behind glass. Visitors from around the world, including, every year, American veterans who return to the country they once fought in, stand in that room and look at the bamboo stakes and the simple pit mechanisms and the elementary tripwires, and they feel something complicated, something between awe and grief, because the thing in that glass case is just a sharpened stick, a piece of jungle, something a child could make in an afternoon with a knife and an hour of patience. And it changed the world. Somewhere in the hill provinces of Quảng Trị and Thái Ninh, in the deep jungle where the war was fought at the level of single footsteps and held breath, the paths are still there, grown over now, reclaimed by the forest, unmarked. The traps are long gone, disarmed, decayed, dissolved back into the earth from which they came. But veterans who walk those hills today report the same thing. Decades later, in peacetime, with no war in living memory, they still look down before they step.